Good evening and welcome to today's dialogue panel. The topic is quite an interesting topic. It's called Embracing a Gig World, Paychecks, Protections, Purpose, and Skills. Shreyana, that sounds like a World Bank wrote this topic. Nothing simple or clear about this, but let's see what we can do. We're delighted to have an extraordinary panel today with us. We have Daisy Amandani from Cron Trust from Kenya. We have Amitabh Kant, the CEO of Niti Aayog, who has joined us. We have Stravos Yanuka, who is the CEO of World Innovation Summit for Education, Qatar Foundation. And from the OECD, Director of Global Relations, Andreas Schall. And I'm delighted my colleague Shreyana Bhattacharya is with us. She is a senior economist, social protection and jobs. And I have to be very honest with you that everything that I understand about social protection is because of Shreyana. So I'm not sure what questions I'm going to be able to ask her that will tax her, but we'll see. Can I start off slightly differently? Can I ask one or two people that what questions do you have in your minds for this panel? Just want to get a sense of what you're thinking about as we start the panel. That'll at least guide me in what kind of questions I will ask. So any volunteers to share one or two questions?
What is the fastest way to make sure that countries like India, Bangladesh, many developing countries catch up far faster to the science and underlying technology that's driving the changes in the digital world?
Very good.
So my question is, will the skills migration, the migration of skilled professionals will redefine the world's economic balance in coming decade?
Matthew Asada, and I wanted to ask a question again. We're a couple years on from the demonetization exercise, and I want to know about the use of cash and the use of electronic payments here in India, specifically as it applies to kind of the informal sector.
Very good. And the lady that's in front right there?
Hello. My question would be about the future of the work in the intercultural environment as a background, because the more we are going closer towards each other, the nature of the work changes, and digitization, and how to comply this with these basic ideas of dialogue, which somehow is missing today.
Thank you. So you can see there's quite a spectrum of thinking in the audience as we come in. You know, for me, as I looked at this daunting title and thought a little bit about it, it's striking that today in France, there is a protest going on. And the protest is that there is a sense that France's 52 or 62 pension schemes ought to be kept as 52, 62 pension schemes, that these schemes should not be created into one system of universal pension. There's a pushback that's coming from citizens, or at least an organized citizens, about the nature of the social protection. Or if you come to India, you have a very interesting debate that is happening and discussion, which is about the relationship between pricing of electricity and groundwater. Farmers in many parts of India get free electricity. And when they get free electricity, they have very little constraint in drawing groundwater from groundwater, which is being depleted. And so many people are saying that instead of providing social protection through the pricing of electricity, let's provide it through an income support, a very different context of debate and discussion. Then if you begin to look around the world, you see few other sort of factors that are emerging. One is certainly this issue of the growth of the informal sector. And today I think there's a sense that informal is the new normal, and that the traditional story of formal jobs, industrial jobs, is not the way the future of work will be. So in that context, what does one think of in terms of a social protection? You also have a world where technology is changing nature of jobs. And here, I think there's a challenge that governments face. And the governments are facing the challenge where rather than protecting workers from change, they can shift to efforts of protecting workers for change. That's a fundamentally different approach to engaging in terms of governments and citizen. But I think fundamentally, as I looked around in terms of the dialogue that's happening, what's very clear is that the industrial era risk sharing policies that rely heavily on place of employment as a stable platform and the employee as the steady, fast implementing agency of social policy no longer applies. That it's a very different workforce, very different work program, and you have to figure out social protection in a very different way. So once you begin to look at these various different factors, whether you're in France or India, where technology changes and the whole relation between government and citizens about social protection, there is a real shift in debate about the importance of social protection, the need for social protection, and how social protection should be put on the table. It's, if one could borrow the words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there is a different social contract that is emerging between states and their citizen. And then if you put on top of all of that, climate change and shocks, right? So you have India that has lifted 160 million people out of poverty in the last decade, but they're just above poverty. Any shocks to this group pushes them back down into poverty. They're in a vulnerability era. And in an era where you have climate change and you have climatic shocks, the shocks are a very, very important transmission, which does not enable nations to continue to hope that the rise out of poverty is going to be a linear process. So how do you deal with a social protection system that must address this issue of uncertainty and shocks? Well, we have good news. Our panel is going to answer all of those questions. And let's see if we can create a dialogue and have them put forward some of their thoughts, and then we'll open up a discussion with all of you. Maybe I can start off with the following question to our colleagues. Why is social protection an important topic in today's political economy? Traditionally, we in development have always thought that if you could do growth, economic growth, and if you could do service delivery, that's the name of the game. Why must we invest in social protection? What's the story there? And in fact, we would say social protection is really a luxury of rich countries. It's not really something that the poor countries can afford. Rather, let's just focus on economic growth and service delivery. That's the best social protection you can give. But clearly, that is not the paradigm that we see today. So let me get a sense as a first round from you. Why do you think this focus on social protection has become so important in the political economy of nations? Maybe we can start from a perspective from Kenya.
Thank you. Good evening. I think social protection is important because you will always have vulnerable people within your society. You will, and when you don't plan for them, then they enter into those shocks that you talk about, and they become a burden. And especially in developing countries like our country, the dependency ratio is very, very high. And we still have challenges of employment, underemployment, and you find that when the vulnerable members of your society, of your family, enter into some kind of distress, it becomes distress for everybody. And many people fall into poverty simply because of the shocks that they find themselves in due to lack of social protection. And so it is becoming increasingly important for governments to begin to invest in social protection. The Kenya government has invested in social protection, particularly to the aged, because many of them are being abandoned, by their families who absolutely cannot help them. And with the breakdown or inefficiency in our social protection system, these people really, really, become extremely vulnerable. So I think that answers that question, and governments have a responsibility and cannot run away from it.
Amitabh, looking at it from India's perspective, is this focus on vulnerability the driving force of the story on social protection in India?
Well, Junaid, my view is that it's not possible for a country to grow at high rates for a long period of time on a sustained, continuous basis if you're not able to do social inclusion. And India has grown at rates of 8 to 9% in the past for about 5 to 6 years. But if you want to sustain this over a 3-decade period, that's what India needs to do, to grow at 9 to 10% year after year for 3 decades or more. Because you're passing through a window of demographic transition, which rarely happens in history. Your average age of population is 29. And therefore, you can't have a scenario where 1 in 2 women is anemic, 1 in 3 people are stunted, 1 in 5 are wasted, and that a vast segment of your population is going below the poverty line because you're not able to provide good tertiary care. And therefore, to my mind, education, health, nutrition are very important. But equally important is a very, very high degree of social protection to ensure that these people do not go below the poverty line. And that alone can ensure that you are able to grow as an economy on a sustained basis over a long period of time. So growth imperative requires social protection.
So this is very important because I think there's been quite a shift in terms of thinking that social protection is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do if you're interested in economic growth. So from your perspective in Kenya, it's the right thing to do because of vulnerability. And from India, what you're saying is if you don't invest in that, dealing with that vulnerability, your economic growth path itself will be challenged. Maybe I can ask our colleague, though I know you don't represent Qatar necessarily, but can you talk a little bit about the high middle-income countries such as Qatar? What's their perspective on social protection? And I'd be very curious to understand from the foundation that you represent, how does it look at social protection?
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I am from Qatar Foundation, so I can speak to some of the work that Qatar Foundation does. I think that in looking at the challenge that we're facing today, I think it's important to recognize that this is not a new challenge. In my view, the gig economy is just the latest buzzword, I think, for a trend that is 40 years at least in the making, which is a steady shift in the balance of power between capital and labor in favor of the former. And so what we're seeing now through the gig economy are, growing efficiencies as a result of automation, technology being applied to more and more sectors, and therefore reducing the bargaining power of labor. And this is happening across the board in high and middle income countries, as well as in the developing world. And the need for social protection, I think, stems from the fact that a large number of people in employment feel insecure, and with some justification. We know that jobs for life are becoming rarer. We know that pension schemes that used to be extremely generous, and you mentioned France, and that's an interesting case. I think everyone who is not personally affected by those changes sees the logic of what the government is trying to do, but nobody likes to have benefits taken away from them. And so if you've grown up feeling that you are entitled to something, or you've expected something and suddenly it's taken away from you, obviously you react and protest. And so I see that the gig economy, the gig world, as part of a much broader trend, which does not seem to be abating in any way, shape, or form. Now, what does that this means, I think growing demand for social protection will continue. What shape that will take, I think, is yet to be determined. I'm in education. I represent WISE, which is the World Innovation Summit for Education. We're an education think tank and forum that just celebrated its 10th year anniversary in 2019. What we see is growing calls for education to step in as some sort of silver bullet.
Travers,
yeah.
Hold on.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll come
Okay.
to what we
I'll
think are the
stop there.
elements
Yeah.
of a social protection. I'd like you to pick that theme up of education, which I think is extremely important. But let me ask Andreas, for you to complete this round of discussion, OECD countries, where is the political economy debate on social protection in OECD countries? Is it reflecting what we're hearing, vulnerability, investment in growth, and the impact of a gig economy where clearly the power structure between capital and labor, as Stravos has said, has changed? What's the driving force of the debate on social protection in OECD countries?
Thank you very much. Good evening. Allow me to go back not only in order to answer this question, not only 40 years, but 140 years, and take you on a little journey. We are not writing the year 2020, but the year 1880. We are not in Delhi, but we are in Berlin, and we are in Gelsenkirchen in Germany. And there you have the steel workers on the street, you have the coal miners on the street protesting against their working condition, protesting that they have no health insurance, protesting that nobody takes care of them and their families when they retire from a really hard working job in the coal mines. And then there is a pretty smart guy called Otto von Bismarck, who was the federal or the chancellor, not the federal chancellor, the chancellor of the Deutsches Reich, of the German Empire at that moment in time, who starts reforming and creating social protection system for the industrial workers at that time, because not only because he was such a nice man, but also because he wanted to stay in power, and he wanted, as our colleague from Niti Aayog said, you need to bring the people with you in order to have growth, in order to have development. And one idea, this visionary, the first kind of social protection scholar, I would say, had, was to bring the workers on board to create social protection. Now, and here I'm taking up from where Carl Bildt has left it. In many of our advanced economies, we are still coping with these systems which have been created for the industrial world. And you were hinting in your moderation that they may not be fit for the gig economy anymore. And our analysis, and I brought a book, whenever we don't know what to say, we put out a book, The Future of Work. So I can leave with you. I will not say anything what's in there, but it's a pretty good book. So some of our analysis shows, for example, that only 50% of the current non-standard workers, which means the informal workers, the entrepreneurs, the bloggers, they have social protection. At the same time, you're confronted with a situation that our analysis shows that 12% of all jobs may be lost due to the technological transformation, and 32% of all jobs will be modified, meaning you need more skills. And this together with a missing social protection or missing system creates some uncertainty. And this also brings some people in the street who are protected, as said, by a system of the old world, by a system which is not yet adapted to the new world, but this requires change, and it requires to bring the people with. And one of the questions we need to answer today, I think, is how to bring the people with.
Shana, you work in an institution that has a global reach, and therefore we're looking at lessons learned from different parts of the world. Do you see this trend towards investing in social protection as now an important platform of a development dialogue?
No, in fact, Junaid, absolutely. And two facts, I think, just, for us to remember. And I just want to highlight, I fully agree with the point that was earlier made, that the idea of the gig economy, I mean, we've been confronted with this in countries like India or Brazil, where you have large shares of informality for a very long period of time. And what you actually now see in many of these countries, which in fact can now share lessons with the rest of the world, is how do you design a social protection system which is de-linked from the payroll, which is no longer linked to just your place of work. So if you look at India, for example, you have a large health insurance program, which essentially is quasi-universal and yet has no relationship to your place of work. You have pension schemes which are not tagged to where you work. Brazil has large cash grant programs and pension programs and social insurance schemes which are targeted through very different mechanisms, through transactions or other ways, not through your place of work. So what we're seeing increasingly is this lesson that we're learning, that we now need to create a social protection architecture where you're no longer providing benefits or social security to people just through their place of work, is actually a lesson that has been operationalized in many of the upper middle income countries or lower middle income countries. And yes, they're fragmented and there are lessons to be learned from there. There's lessons to be learned from what Indonesia has done or what Brazil has done. But these lessons can be scaled up and harmonized for a broader development dialogue.
Amitabh, if I take off from where Shriana has pointed out, she's saying clearly the shift towards a social protection system not linked to the place of employment is a very, very important principle. Can you talk to us a little bit about how India is going about this storyline? And to talk to us a little bit about one of the things I worry in India is this is a country where we have so many schemes, and schemes continue to multiply, but systems take time to emerge. Are we seeing a social protection system emerge in India?
Well, Junaid, the biggest thing that's happened in India, I think, is the fact that all Indians have a biometric. So you have 1,200 million biometric. No country in the world has 1,200 million biometrics. We are also the only country in the world which has 1,200 million mobile. And we have 1,200 million bank accounts. That is, every individual has a bank account. Many years back, I was working in the state of Kerala in the fisheries sector. And one of my challenge was to increase their earnings from the market. They used to just get about 20% of the market price. We gave them new fishing nets, new crafts, new boats, but it was impossible to open a bank account. It used to take 7-8 months to open a bank account. Know your customer was a nightmare. Today in India, you can open a bank account in just exactly less than a minute using your biometric. So once you opened your bank account, about 600 schemes of the government of India, and India, one of our prime ministers said that only 15% of a rupee reaches the poor person. But today, 100% reaches, because we put it straight into the bank account of the individual. He's able to take it out using his biometric. And therefore, what we've proved is that if you are using technology to leapfrog, and if you're able to open bank accounts for every individual, you will be able to provide huge amount of social protection across the board. And that has been demonstrated by the new Ayushman Bharat scheme. Not only have we opened, we've said we'll be opening about 150,000 primary health and wellness centers at the grassroots level for preventive care, but we've created the world's biggest insurance scheme. That is 500 million Indians insured digitally. I mean, it's a cashless, paperless, portable scheme. So you can be living in Bihar, you can be traveling to Kerala from one part of India to the other, you'll carry your insurance scheme. And therefore, whether you're working or not, whether you're a gig worker, whether you are a formal worker, and to my mind, the world of formal and informal is all dead, simply because you are today digitally carrying your benefits of that scheme. And same thing with the Atal Pension Yojana, which is all meant for informal workers. So any gig worker can get tied up with the Atal Pension Yojana, and he can move from any part of India to another geography, and he'll carry his pension along with him. So to my mind, the nature of work has changed. the nature of employment has changed, the nature of lifestyle has changed, and the only way you can ensure protection is by technology and by using biometric, by using mobile phones, and by using bank account. And this is a very, very powerful tool of the JAM Trinity. And without that, it will not be possible to provide efficient protection to the workers.
So I'm going to ask Daisy to reflect a little bit on whether these kind of changes using technology and getting money to citizens is happening in Kenya. But before you do that, let me just go back to Amitabh on one point. Amitabh, you're describing a very different approach of a relation between government and citizen. What do you need to do in terms of investing in state capability to actually implement this kind of a social protection system? Because clearly it's a very, very different approach to social protection. Do you see in India a growth of that kind of capability within the state to manage such a program?
So I think a huge amount of ability to be able to build up institutions. I mean, like we've built up, linking up 150 odd banks which are tied up at the back end through the unified payment interface, which enables you to transfer money seamlessly, digitally, or to create Ayushman Bharat model, and to be able to create an institution which is with the ability to get the best digital technology, but also to bring in the best people from across the world. Some of the finest people work for that scheme to be able to do it on a real-time basis. The crux of this whole thing is, to my mind, to be able to understand that you will not be able to do this unless you don't allow data to flow on a real-time basis. Efficiency comes if data is flowing on a real-time basis. You're able to analyze, you're able to do machine learning, you're able to do artificial intelligence, and you're able to put all this in public domain. And states which are performing well, you reward them. States which are not performing, you name and shame them. And that is important. So the crux of this whole social protection is about building great institutions, bringing in real-time data, creating a sense of competition, and putting everything in public domain.
So Daisy, can you reflect a little bit whether Kenya is also, if you will, piggybacking on this technology change to do the type of social protection system that Amitabh is talking about? Clearly, India and Kenya are very different, but even Kenya is moving towards a county-based decentralized government, whether that kind of decentralized system enables you to do this kind of social protection system better.
I think it definitely would enable the government to be able to do it better. You know, we have the M-Pesa, the mobile money transfers, and that also has been a game changer, particularly in reaching the unbanked. Your phone literally works as a bank, although the transfers are mainly done through the post office. But increasingly, we're beginning to see that while the government, you talk about data being very critical to being able to establish these kind of systems. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, particularly with reference to our government, is a lack of trust. What are they going to do with this information? And we've had a situation where the government has actually tried to collect data. And actually, I think one of the examples that were given was in India, you know, where also it was a bit controversial. There is a huge lack of trust in the government and the way the government has done things, because primarily there has been mismanagement of social services and the monies that have been committed to government. So with that respect, I think bringing the people along, you would need to have a multi-pronged strategy where they are comfortable to give this information and understand that it is for their well-being. Because ultimately, I think we mustn't miss the point that social protection is about dignity. It's about securing the people's dignity. But when we see, especially coming from governments like ours, that have rundown systems that don't dignify the people, I think we need to build that trust, because we have a huge trust deficit in Kenya. However, having said that, there are initiatives aimed at addressing this. We do have some good schemes that the government has put in place. The maternal system, the Linda Mama scheme, where you have maternity protections to the women. You have availability through the county governments. We have at least 2 county governments that have made universal health care available to their county residents using these schemes. Although we're not yet at the digital place, we're still, getting the cards and all, but we are moving in the right direction. I think I need to say that we are moving in the right direction. We have private companies that are also doing the same. And people are beginning to see the usefulness of technology because you are putting those protections in their hands and they're able to track it. So I think that we can harness technology, and Kenya is not afraid of technology because we have already, blazed the trail in some of those areas. So I do think that that is an opportunity. I like the idea of delinking it from the traditional work, because the gig economy is increasingly becoming prevalent in Kenya. We have things like these, the boda riders, so you've got Uber. All these don't have social protection. So if those can be targeted for such schemes, then of course it works for the betterment of the family and more inclusion, more social inclusion.
So, Shreyana, as I listen to Amitabh and Daisy, they talk with optimism about technology, but they also are raising issues that you need good institutions, and very much this issue of there has to be a different level of trust between government and the citizen. So there seems to be implied in these conversations that there's a really rethinking of the state if it's to deliver social protection in the way it's done. What are we learning about how the state must change in order to deliver this kind of social protection?
Junaid, a lot of what I think I'm about to say comes from support that we've been providing to subnational governments, state governments in India trying to strengthen their social protection systems using technology to deliver. And there are 2 large areas where there's a lot of appetite and enthusiasm, and I think Mr. Kant sort of raised these, which is one, can we use digital payments, mobile monies, to make sure people access payments more regularly? So this is the large direct benefit transfer agenda in India. And the other is, can we start to think about better ways to use data to target people for programs, right? So if you now live in this world where we need to delink who receives a pension or who receives benefits from their place of work, how do we actually know who we target these benefits to? And many states have struggled with this. In India, there's been the big initiative to use the socioeconomic census data. Some of it has worked, some of it has proven challenging. And I think what we're learning from efforts at the subnational level, and I'm also going to draw on experiences of Brazil and Indonesia here, are 3 things. One is the local state needs to radically transform itself. And what I mean by that is currently, if I were to walk into the last mile unit of, say, the Indian government's, say the panchayat office or the village level office, the types of people, skills, the ratio of people to the amount of demand that they're supposed to process needs to completely transform, because right now you have one person responsible for a large set of tasks without the competencies digital to be able to do this. You look at a state like Brazil, if you go to the local level, you have, at municipality levels, you'll have social workers, people who are actually able to deal with hardware and software issues far better. So in terms of the sizing of the local state, there needs to be considerable rethinking and a reimagination of what the local bureaucracy can look like. And in fact, it's quite remarkable, some of the changes that you've seen in India, be it the PMJ scheme, be it even the National Food Security Act, these large programs which are reaching 800 million people annually, with the current local bureaucracy not really being equipped or designed to deal with such a tech-savvy welfare state. So I think one of the big lessons that we're learning is that the human needs to complement the digital. And while right now there's a lot of appetite to set in digital platforms, who are the people who will be trained, recruited, hired, and motivated to actually manage these systems is an open question, and one that I think different countries can learn from each other from. Certainly, I think Mexico and Brazil have a lot to share with other countries that are on this path. But we do know that the local state needs to change and be redesigned to be much more tech savvy than it currently is.
So this is, if I were to conclude this first phase of discussion, and then I want to come back to the education question. For me, there's several messages that come out. One message is clearly that social protection today is not just about doing the right thing for people, but it's also investing in the economics of a nation. So my first proposition that why worry about social protection, let's just worry about economic growth, you can't do that. I think this has come out very clearly from what our colleagues have said. Second thing that our colleagues have said is technology may be a factor in changing things, but it's also a very big factor in actually enabling you to do social protection. And the linkage between identifying the poor, opening up bank accounts, and cash transfers are a very, very powerful tool that needs to be looked at. And the third thing that I take away from this conversation is that these are not simple technological shifts. What is needed underlying this is a very different state that must function. And state at the local level becomes extremely, extremely important. And these are, I think, a very, very important lessons that our colleagues are sharing with us. Let me shift the conversation back to you, Stavros. You started off, before I rudely interrupted you, on how you see education playing an important role in this arena of social protection. Can you take us through your thoughts there?
Thank you, and you weren't rude. I've been a moderator myself, and you did the right thing stopping me when you did. I was actually about to say that people look at education as offering some sort of silver bullet, and I want to actually spend a little bit of time, if you allow me, dispelling that myth, because I don't think you can have education substitute for what ails society more broadly. So just 2 minutes on what education cannot do. Education cannot influence the overall structure of employment in an economy. That is beyond the remit of education. And I have long been a skeptic of the argument that says that there are millions of jobs out there that remain unfilled because people don't have the right skills. And the reason I'm skeptical is because the private sector is incredibly efficient at doing so many things that you would think that if there are these millions of jobs out there that are unfilled because of skills, they would have set up some kind of workplace training schemes or apprenticeship schemes that would have provided for training, and that's just not happening in the economy right now. What education cannot do is influence the design and deployment of social safety nets. Again, back to the conversation that's been happening, and I'm glad we've included healthcare and we're talking about education as part of that package. In developed countries, the obsession is with pensions, and pensions are only part of the equation. And as Andreas, I think, very aptly reminded us, the pension schemes that exist in the West today were designed for an era where people's retirement could be measured in single-digit years. They weren't designed for people retiring at 62 and living well into their 80s. So there's some adjustment there. And then the last piece, education can't do anything about the supply of housing stock. And again, we haven't talked about housing. And that's a big issue, I think, globally, because what tends to happen is economic activity tends to be concentrated in large urban agglomerations, and housing and the lack of housing becomes a huge issue. Now, very quickly on what education can do. Next week, WISE, together with Ipsos, are launching an education barometer, which we hope will supplement work that's done by folks like the OECD on PISA, where we're measuring attitudes to education. And the first barometer, we polled about 10,000 people across over 20 countries, including India, China, Nigeria, Brazil, Mexico, as well as the developed world. And we were actually quite surprised because what we found was there's actually general satisfaction with overall levels of education, but there are persistent failures, meaning that around between 10 and 20% of the population seems to be underserved by the current education system. And having studied PISA fairly closely over the last 10 or so years, that chimes with what you see in PISA, where you see about 10 to 20% of the population, even in high-performing countries, failing in their tests. So concentrating, having the education system concentrate on that proportion of the population that seems to be failing is probably well worth investing time and resource to. So that's one thing education can do, is catch those who are failing or whom the system is failing. The second piece is dramatically expanding access to higher education. We all know that higher education tends to correlate positively with lifetime outcomes, including employment. What we don't talk as much about, though, is who is getting in the higher education opportunities. And here, there's evidence from the US and elsewhere that high and higher income families disproportionately benefit from access to higher education. There's evidence, though, again, more hopeful, that suggests that actually, if you come from a high middle income country, getting to higher education per se doesn't actually change your life outcomes that much. In other words, you and your family have enough social capital that you're going to do well, whether you get to the top university or maybe a middle-ranking university or so on. It makes a huge difference, though, to people from lower income. So again, enabling lower-income families and their children to access higher education, probably worth, again, investing in. And then the final piece of the puzzle for education, I think, is investing in lifelong learning opportunities in collaboration with other actors in the economy. And here, just a quick mention of a Canadian initiative called Groundswell that's being rolled out now nationwide. It's essentially a coming together of successful business people and entrepreneurs together with credit union financial institutions to provide essentially entrepreneurship education and support to lower income folks who want to set up new businesses. And these don't have to be the sexy, high-tech startups. They can be SMEs, they can be a corner store, they can be a beauty salon, they could, whatever it is. Investing in helping people set up SMEs, again, I think is an underappreciated and underleveraged aspect of the social suite, if you will. I'll stop there.
When it comes to education, I've always been influenced by Mark Twain, when Mark Twain said that he never let schooling get in the way of his education. And I worry that in a world where government has to start preparing people for change rather than protecting them from change, that this whole nature of how education and skilling is delivered has to be rethought. Otherwise, you are putting too much burden on a cash social protection system, but not in a protection system that's investing in the human skills that are needed for change. So let me ask Andreas, OECD countries, how is the whole arena of education, how are the arena of education and skilling changing, if at all, in the OECD countries? And then I'd like to ask our other colleagues from India and Kenya whether they're seeing a change in the way schooling and skilling are being done to deal with a world where change is happening at a phenomenal base.
Yeah, I think I could not agree more with both of you, with all what you've been said. And I think education is in a fundamental process of change. We have been too long looking only at the cognitive aspects of education, and there were some studies done by Richard Layard and others looking what makes the success of people in digital age, and they came up with it's about 60 to 70%. It's social skills, 25% emotional skills, and only 10 to 15% cognitive skills. And look at our education systems, how we build them. We focus, and I see it at my kids, we focus on the cognitive skills, of course. So going forward, and this becomes in this what we call gig economy or digital economy, however you want to call it, what will become more important is that we teach our kids to work in teams, to be empathetic, to kind of have a completely different skill set. And this becomes even more important and you were referring to, let's say, I would not call them the losers, but maybe the low-skilled or the middle-skilled in the system. Those jobs are at risk more for automation. Those jobs are at risk more for getting changed. So the pressure to have lifelong learning and lifelong, I mean, again, going back to the 1880s, I mean, there you had the paradigm of lifetime unemployment. You came from school, you had a skill set, you signed a contract with a company, you stayed there till 60, 65, or till you die, and then it was done. This is no longer the biographies you will have today. So you need to kind of fundamentally change also how you prepare pupils, young kids, early childhood education, how you prepare the people for the changes. Be aware that they need to change their jobs more often, they need to change their capabilities, their skills more often, and also they may need more on the social and emotional side than any generation before.
Just a slightly parenthesis question before we go back to the theme. Europe is dealing with, I will use both terms, refugees and migrants into Europe. What kind of pressure is that putting on your social protection system or the politics of social protection?
I mean, I think the system per se is under pressure because our financing system, as Stavros was saying, was based on an assumption that you may have a lifespan of 70, 75 years old. Now people are getting 90. And I mean, the beauty of the system which was invented in the Prussian system was that everything had a financing component. And this actually is something I wanted to discuss with Amitabh and also with Stacy. I mean, the issue is, it's very good to have a kind of a portability system. But the question is, how does this work from the financing side, and what does it mean for the social contract? And this is something what we had in Europe. I mean, there was a social contract to say that those who are in active employment pay for the retirees. Now we may have only, I mean, my country is aging quite a lot. We may have only 1/3 of the people paying for 2/3 of the rest, which is no longer sustainable in social protection, especially it's always about transfer. So we always need to kind of see what's behind. The migration discussion, of course, in this current context where the people have already fears that they would lose their benefits and their revenues on what they paid for, because some of them paid for their whole life into a system to get some returns at the end of their life. They paid into health insurance in order to be, and then they see that people are coming, moving to the countries. And so this increases, I mean, I'm not justifying this, but I mean, I'm just explaining that this increases, the migration increases the fear of the people to lose again more of their privileges and also of their real expectations on the system. So yes, it increases the pressure.
I think if we were to summarize or tease out a few more sort of issues, clearly one of the issue is in a society that's going through demographic shifts, financing of social protection, big issue, and the political economy of social protection being buffeted by migration, whether it's refugees or skilled workers. I think these are very deep issues that will affect the social protection story. But let's come back to the skills in education. Shana, talk to us a little bit from a global perspective before we go to India and Kenya. What are we seeing in terms of how education and skilling is changing in today's world as technology changes and as the economy changes?
So, Junaid, I think there are three broad trends which are extremely important. In fact, many of the conversations right now alluded and touched upon them. One is the fact that we realize the traditional method of skilling through, say, large government programs, which are also quite cumbersome and complex to implement, is not functioning at scale, and especially not functioning with the nimbleness that you expect these programs to, because the nature of demands in the labor market are changing. So the ability of governments to constantly redesign programs to meet those demands is expecting perhaps too much for a traditional government setup. So you see as a consequence much more role of technology, different forms of learning, modules which are mobile, thinking about ways where the private sector can come in, and then challenges around regulating that particular sphere. And I think certainly the Indian example with how the Skill India mission is going about it has useful lessons, and also lessons around where perhaps private sector hasn't really stepped in as much. The second trend that we're seeing is we're realizing that different groups, and by this we mean vulnerable groups, need different mechanisms in the way we think about outreach and training, and in particular adolescent girls, the agenda around young women, and we see especially in these parts of the world where female labor force participation rates have been dropping and continue to be a concern. Despite the fact that governments are investing heavily in programs which target young women, you don't yet see women come out and take up jobs after. They'll be in training, but there's high attrition rates. And there are questions, I mean, and during discussions we can talk a bit about, is it just social norms? Some people would say it's also the kind of training, the way training is imparted. Are we really preparing women for the types of jobs that are out there in the labor market? So thinking much more carefully about designing curriculum and also methods of outreach for specific target groups. And the third, and I think this is where it touches upon some of the questions, in fact, on the social protection agenda as well, is in large, diverse countries, how do you handle the fact that the labor market looks extremely different at different subnational levels? So, for example, we're sitting right now in Delhi. The labor market here and the demands for trainings, the kind of jobs that exist are completely different than, say, a Bihar. And yet, when you look at public sector intervention, because of the nature of public sector intervention, you still have the one scheme that then just needs to be plugged into Delhi, into Bihar. And I imagine this is similar for lots of other countries which are dealing with that kind of diversity. And that hasn't really been an easy question to fix. Countries are coming up with different ways. One is just to be heavily decentralized in the way you design these programs. The other is to allow within big national programs the ability for subnational governments to tailor and tinker, but perhaps not adequately. And I think that reality of dealing with the federal nature and the really diverse nature of large nation states for the skills agenda as well as the social protection agenda continues to be a challenge. There are more questions than answers there, but there are different countries that are trying different models.
Okay, so I've been very bad about time control, so Amitabh and Daisy, just bear with me because I want to just come to the audience and get a few reactions to the conversations they've heard, because we're facing a bit of a crunch time, and then I'll just ask you all to conclude if I may. Yes, please, sir. So rapid summary, rapid question would be welcome.
Yeah, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Is that working? Yeah. Herbert Dieter, University of Hong Kong. I wonder whether we haven't spared one of the key questions regarding the financing of Social Security. And that question is to Mr. Kant as well as to Mr. Shah. we have seen in the OECD world and beyond a dismantling of restrictions on capital flow since 50 years, which has made it very difficult to tax corporate profits. And that might be one of the key issues. We talk about details here, but the grand picture is that, say 50 years ago, governments were able to tax corporate profits, and with that, they could finance embedded liberalism, as it was called at the time. Today, even in the European Union, we are unable to tax corporate profits properly. We have tax havens, where one of them is the Netherlands, believe it or not. And that is the underlying issue that I think you should address. We cannot find a form of redistribution, which it basically is, if capital can hide profits wherever it wants to. I would like to remind the audience that Apple alone parked 250 billion US dollars outside the United States a while ago. So what do you say about that? And shouldn't we talk about those more fundamental issues before we talk about the details of how to educate whom, when, and why?
Well, I think if you were to take away anything from this conversation, is we're trying to put on the table the complexity of what a modern day social protection system looks like. So skilling, education, delivery, cash transfers, and your point, how the heck do you finance all of this in a world that capital is mobile, right? Which is, by the way, the reflection of it is when people are mobile, it also puts stress on social protection system. We'll come to that. One more comment from, yes, please.
I was really pleased that Shriana rescued the session from being gender blind. It does strike me that is one of the massive missing areas of discussion. I'd just love some closing thoughts about the potential role of new technologies to change the position of women and get them to the forefront of change, not remain at the back.
You took away my punchline. I was going to really go after this panel for doing that, but you've done it in a polite way. So I will have to ask them to respond in a polite way. So two important questions that have come up. One is financing social protection, and the other is role of gender. Maybe we start with Daisy, whichever of these two questions you want to tackle.
I'll address myself to the gender question, and shamefully, that should have been where I should have started, because that's the focus of my work. However, and I will speak specifically for Kenya, that is really a major challenge, because we're still struggling with keeping girls in school, you know, even before we talk about skilling women, you know, for the new emerging world. And of course, that is something that needs to be thought out. And having said that, I think we need to be careful not to design sort of like cut and paste solutions, you know? We should have solutions that look at your internal challenges and, of course, your regional and global competitiveness. In Kenya, there is an attempt by government to address the education sector. It is very bumpy. It is, you know, it's very disruptive. But they're very clear that, you know, we definitely need to look at the emerging world and begin to skill our workforce differently. Whether they're doing it right, I think more thought needs to go into it. I think governments really do need to engage in more research and development to design their programs. So not that we see what is working in India and run to adopt it in our country, because the dynamics are different. But having said that, the fact that they're thinking in that direction, for me, it's a good sign. Understanding that for us to continue to be competitive, we have to address that. But the future belongs to those people who design it. So the people who are out there first. I think also the other thing that we need to look at is open sources of sharing, sharing technology and sharing interventions that actually work, and more collaboration at designing hybrids that can actually work to address the challenges. We are talking about a more globally interactive world. We're talking these days about global citizens. We're talking about leaving nobody behind. And so I think that entails the need for shared technology, shared interventions, shared outcomes, so that indeed nobody is left behind.
Amitabh, on the finance story.
Let me first touch on the education. And I think it's important to say that it's not possible to bring in, prepare yourself for the gig economy with this Anglo-Saxon system of education which we've inherited. So you need to first disrupt that. And, because you study books, you get into the next class, you keep getting in, and without improvement on either learning outcomes or on great competence. So one of the things we've tried to do in Niti Aayog is to start about close to 5,000 tinkering labs. And we provide robots, 3D printers, Internet of Things, all from class 6 onwards. And we've seen a radical transformation, and particularly in the tinkering labs that we started in all girls schools. And we had, it's a remarkable transformation in terms of making a far more innovative society. So my view is very, very strongly, firstly, just disrupt this whole system of studying books and the rote model of education and open the students to a lot of innovative new world of today. And we find these students really remarkable. The second point I want to make is that it's not about access of education. We've been able to provide access of education to all, but learning outcomes still remain poor, and therefore focus on great competence. And that's very important, that you can have 10 to 15% of the students doing exceptionally well, but the remaining class remains behind. So the entire great competence is very critical. And third, I would say, is early childhood education, because many of us in different countries start our education too late. At the age of 5+, it's just too late. You start at the age of 2.5+, and you'll see the mind is at its fertile best, and the child will just skyrocket. So if you want to prepare your kid for the gig economy, that's it. We found this, we have this young startup called Aditi who runs Imbibe, young girl, who tracks every single student in the state of Rajasthan longitudinally and latitudinally like you track Uber vehicles. And she tells you where your learning outcomes are, and then provides extra dosage of education to those who've been left behind in different subjects. And the state of Rajasthan has done incredibly well through the sheer use of technology. So that's what you need to do, really. Track every single student on learning outcome. That's the challenge. Fourthly, on this question of taxation, I'm personally not a great believer in excessive degree of taxation. My belief always has been that countries which have lagged behind have failed in sheer governance. The challenges of governance, the challenges of whatever resources you have, you should be able to deliver much better. And that is where the failure is. Let's not blame bad, poor governance on taxation.
Okay. Now, literally because of timing, I'm going to ask 1 minute, one message for the remaining 3 colleagues. So 1 minute, one message.
Actually, I'm going to respond to the financing question to say, now that we live in a world, look, different countries, depending on their own expenditure path, will come up with their own mechanisms for how you finance these programs. In countries like India, where there is an opportunity is subsidy reform, because you can think about substituting a large subsidy bill with these particular programs, and that's already happening in some states. You can think about carbon pricing. There are different mechanisms that are available to think about financing of these programs, which at least allow for those revenues to be.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Professor Dieter for putting the ball on the penalty for me, because we are the leading organization when it comes to international taxation. 10 years ago, we started an initiative called Automatic Exchange of Information with 32 or 34 OECD countries at that moment in time. Now we have 138 members. The last one was Panama. So there is nowhere where individuals can hide their money anymore. So there is an automatic exchange among all the tax administration. So first point, nowhere to hide. Second, the 2013 we started an initiative on taxation called base erosion and profit shifting, which basically addresses the issue that Apple or Facebook do not pay, hide their profits in one country in order to account the profits with their losses, so they kind of limit their tax burden. In this exercise, which started with the OECD, then it was taken to G20 leaders. We now have 136 countries, all subscribing to the same standard. And now the G20 have asked us to work until next year on a system for digital taxation, taxation of digital economy. So unlike our colleague, I'm a believer in taxation, and I'm a believer in, I very much agree with you. It's also about the efficient delivery on what you do with the taxation. It was Colbert who said, if you collect taxes, it means that you kind of take away the feeders of the duck without getting much complaint by the duck. And this is not our view on taxation, but taxation, in order to sum up my point, we need to have fair taxation in order to have a fair system that works for all. Thanks.
If there's one takeaway for me is that we're dealing with an unequal world, an unequal global society, and education is certainly part of a possible solution, but it's not the only arena in which government has to act. And if I can just summarize, I think what the challenge is that we're facing is capital is globally mobile, labor is semi-mobile, but actually highly immobile. If you again look at the stats, even within countries, people are very reluctant to move. Governance is remarkably local, and unless that dynamic changes, I don't see any quick and ready solutions on the horizon.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the world of social protection, we think very simply of helping the vulnerable. I think what our colleagues have done is shown today in their views and perspectives that the world of social protection in today's context is a deep rethink of the way the state works, but also a deep rethink of how the state works in a global context. This is a fundamentally different ballgame when we think of social protection today. So what's happening in France to what's happening in India in terms of way people are reacting to changes gives you a sense that the world of social protection is in for a major set of disruptions in the coming years. This is going to be a major topic of governments and governance to the years to come. Please join me in thanking our colleagues for their views.